Our approach is based on individual research carried on the imperial diocese in the case of my colleague Andrei Dumitrescu, and related iconographic contexts in my case. And this individual research is coordinated by suggesting a role of the clerical milieu in articulating the rhetoric of power on the one hand, and the iconographic programs on the other. We will analyze the intersections between specific iconographic structures within some Moldavian monuments and the Slavonic adaptations of late Byzantine rituals of power, on the premise that the legitimizing discourse of the secular authority involves its staging through aulic and ecclesiastical rituals whose effectiveness is enhanced by interfering with images and by their relationships that they generate between them. We therefore propose an assessment of the impact that the ideas conveyed in the rhetoric of legitimation of imperial authority had caused on the visual culture of Moldavia, without calling into question the adequacy of this imperial rhetoric to specific political realities. We want to shed light, on the one hand, on iconographic configurations that explain the symbolic parallelism between the Christ the Emperor and the monarchical institution found in liturgical formulas of imperial tradition, and on the other hand, on other iconographic particularities which, in our opinion, prove a strong involvement of the high clergy and of monastic communities in the articulation of this imperial rhetoric. And from this point on, I will give the floor to my colleague, Andrei Dumitrescu, so that he will present his research carried on the issues of put forward by the situation of the representation of the imperial diocese.
Good morning. Vlad, please stop the... Okay, thank you. Technical issues. In a mid-4th, 16th century chronicle, Bishop Macarie of Roman praised Voivode Stephen VI Rareș because he bowed his crowned head before the Emperor of Emperors, and by the mercy of God, he received the anointment with the oil of benediction. End of quote. In contrast to Prince Stephen, his brother Iliash II Rareș was portrayed as an apostate who, I quote again, renounced Christ and received the devil, end of quote, by embracing Islam. Beyond the immediate political motivations of the comparison between the two sons of Peter Rareș, this rhetorical antithesis served as a pretext for introducing a meditation on the ideal position of the earthly sovereign towards Christ, who was perceived as the source of monarchic authority. Using a political vocabulary with an obvious imperial dimension, the chronicle Macarie defined royalty as a divine emanation, a virtue delegated by Christ, the celestial Basileus, to his lieutenants on earth. Although this idea was not explicitly stated in the earlier chronicles of Moldavia, its appropriation was not limited to the writings of Bishop Macarie. Conversely, such topoi were assimilated in the self-defining discourse of local elites since the last decades of the 15th century, alongside many other elements of Byzantine imperial rhetoric, which constituted the subject of an enormous and intricate bibliography. A critical review of all this historiographic material would exceed the purpose of our presentation. While previous studies tended to address almost exclusively written sources, our research reconsiders the role of iconography, rituals, and devotional patterns in shaping the ideal image of Moldavian voivodes. My contribution to this joint paper will investigate the association of the earthly prince with the figure of Christ as Emperor of Emperors, aiming to emphasize the dynamic interaction between mural paintings and Slavonic adaptations of imperial rituals reproduced in Moldavian liturgical manuscripts. During the late medieval period, Middle Bulgarian versions of Byzantine liturgical formulas were one of the main channels for the dissemination of Byzantine political ideas in Moldavian culture. Most scholars have paid special attention to the ritual for coronation and for the promotion of high dignitaries at the court. The complete version of this ceremony was included in a Slavonic missal, Slujebnik, commissioned in 1532 by Metropolitan Theophanes I of Suceava, the former capital of Moldavia, the Bulgarian monastery of Zograf on Mount Athos. The main prayers of this ritual started with the invocation addressed to God the Father or to Christ, presented as universal sovereign. I quote, "O great and eternal God, Emperor of emperors and Lord of lords," end of quote. The prayer, molitva, before the coronation continued with the intercession for the emperor, Tsar, who was identified as a new David, appointed to rule the, I quote, "the holy nation reclaimed through the precious blood of the only begotten Son," end of quote. Subsequently, the bishop implored the heavenly emperor to bless the monarch with the oil of beatitude, with power from above, to place him on the throne of justice, to grant him victory over barbarians and unwavering faith as guardian of the church. Using analogous rhetorical structures, the prayers for the investiture of dignitaries introduce a parallel between the hierarchic order of the terrestrial society and the celestial hierarchy. Similar to the Greek versions from the 11th century Euchologion of Constantinople, the analogy between the two cosmic levels was endorsed through the designation of court ranks with titles that alluded to the second and third orders of the angelic hierarchy, namely authorities, exousias, and in Slavonic, vlasti, and principalities, arhas, or nachala. In the current state of research, the complete version of the taxes for the consecration of monarchs or high statesmen has not been identified in any earlier missal copied or circulated in Moldavia. However, in several articles published since the 1990s, Ivan Biliarsky has shown that Slavonic translations of this text had an ample diffusion in Balkan manuscripts throughout the entire 15th century. Therefore, one may assume that Byzantine prayers for investiture were already known in the East Carpathian Principality long before the arrival of Theophanes Slujebnik from Mount Athos. On the other hand, topoi of the imperial discourse evoked in the ceremonies of coronation or courtly promotion represented a fluid system of references extended in other ritual contexts. Motifs such as the symbolic connection between Christ and the sovereign, his militant fate, or the triumph over barbarians were frequently integrated in the Eucharistic Mass and in other ecclesiastical services. Allusions to the sacred authority of the monarch were a characteristic of the Constantinopolitan ritual transmitted in the Slavonic liturgical tradition. Predictably, some echoes of these imperial practices could be encountered in a series of Middle Bulgarian manuscripts from Moldavia. For instance, as evidenced by an early 16th century missal currently in the library of the Romanian Academy, the prayers for the Tsars were a recurring element in the liturgy attributed to St. John Chrysostom. As the Mass was starting, the fifth petition of the introductory litany, also known as the Great Actene, the deacon prayed, I quote, "for our faithful and God-protected emperors, for all the court and army," end of quote. The supplication continued with a reference to the eternal victory as a principle of legitimacy. I quote again, "Let us pray to the Lord that they may receive assistance in battle, and that all their enemies and opponents may be subdued under their feet," end of quote. Almost identical structures were repeated in many other sections of the Divine Liturgy, including the Eucharistic canon. As elements of ritual performance, the aforementioned fragments accentuated the symbolical continuity between the terrestrial prince, more or less conventionally designated as Tsar, and the eternal kingship of Christ. It is a known fact that in Eastern liturgical tradition, the celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice had an obvious triumphant dimension, which emphasized the paradox of the Savior's death. Although he was crucified and buried as a man, the Son of God was never parted from the right hand of the Father, where he sat as the divine sovereign of the entire cosmos. In the Eucharistic prayers, the glorified image of the salvific sacrifice was constructed through an accumulation of verbal structures that prompted the imperial dignity of Christ, explicitly indicated by epithets such as invisible King, King of glory, King of peace, heavenly King, Lord of seraphim and King of Israel, or even King of kings and Lord of lords. The uttering of these titles in parallel with litanies for the monarch define the relation of symbolic homonymy between the authority of Christ as universal basileus and the imperial office, imitated at least in liturgical practices by Moldavian voivodes. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, the traditional supplication for the Tsars constituted one of the main vehicles for publicly proclaiming the sacred character of the princely institution. However, prayers of consecration and litanies for the Tsars were attested in Moldavian manuscripts only in the first half of the 16th century. One may wonder if we should limit our discussion to this period of time. At this point, art history enters the scene. Analyzing the iconography of Moldavian churches, we have noticed that several mural programs exploited elements of the imperial rhetoric since the final decades of the 1400s. For example, a series of pictorial configurations from princely foundations of Stephen III, who reigned between 1457 and 1504, thematize the symbolic parallel of the celestial emperor and the earthly monarch. As the conserved corpus of 15th century Moldavian manuscripts does not contain any missal or euhologion, we believe that the examination of iconographic programs in a broader Southeastern European context could shed a new light on the assimilation of Byzantine theological and political ideas that shaped the institutional identity of local elites. In the Church of the Prophet Elijah near Suceava, as well as in the Catholicon of Voronezh Monastery, the donor portraits of Stephen III are located on the western wall of the naos as a pendant of a scene commonly known as the imperial diocese or the heavenly court. Visualizing the typological exegesis of Psalm 44-45, I quote, "The queen stood at your right in gold-woven clothing." The image depicts Christ as Emperor of Emperors and Great High Priest, flanked by the supplicant figure of Mary in imperial garments, and by John the Baptist. Placed in close vicinity to the diocese, the votive composition illustrates another intercessional scheme resembling 13th century Serbian models, but also early 15th century frescoes from Ruthenian and Polish regions. Led by the patron saint, the prophet Elijah, or the martyr George, Stephen III presents a miniature model of his foundation to the enthroned figure of Christ. In the church near Suceava, the visual connection of the princely portraits to the heavenly court was enhanced by introducing several intermediate representations of monarchic archetypes, such as King David or the holy emperors Constantine and Helena holding the true cross. Notwithstanding the absence of an analogous sequence, the iconographic selection at Voronezh reflected a similar affinity for depictions of sacred kingship, by figuring Saint John, the Persian emperor, in the lower register of the northern apse. The correspondence between the portraits of Stephen III and the representation of the Emperor of Emperors is also encountered in the recently restored frescoes from the Church of St. Nicholas in Rădăuți. In this case, the images mirror each other as they are placed on two opposite walls of the southern nave. Commissioned towards the end of the 15th century, the frescoes of the dynastic necropolis in Rădăuți were an element of an extensive legitimation campaign centered on the exaltation of Stephen's illustrious, real or fictitious, genealogy. On the southwestern wall, there is an intriguing procession of donors that places the voivode and his heir alongside Alexander the Elder, one of the most glorified figures of the Moldavian ruling family, but also the main benefactor of the monastery. Despite its eloquence, the correlation of the Emperor of Emperors with monarchic effigies was not a common strategy in 14th and 15th century Balkan painting. Analyzing the occurrences of the imperial dioceses in Southeastern Europe and Russia, we have identified only two examples from the late Byzantine period located in Macedonian foundations of Serbian kings. In the Catholicon of Trescavez Monastery, the northern cupola of the inner narthex displays the earliest known version of the heavenly court that surmounts a damaged portrait of Stefan Dusan. Almost 4 decades later, this iconographic correspondence was further developed in the Catholicon of Markov Monastery near Skopje. On the northern wall of the naos, an ample succession of martyrs is led by the Virgin as queen, followed by the prophet David. The procession ends with the portraits of King Marko Mrnjavčević and his father Vukašin and Queen Helena. that face the iconic figures of Constantine the Great and his mother Helena. Resembling Christ, King David, and Saint Constantine, the two Serbian monarchs wear purple robes, loroi, kamelaukia, and even nymphs. In a seminal study on Byzantine imperial imagery, Henry Maguire observed that visual analogies between sacred images and representations of kings alluded to the ideal of monarchy as a sacred office, implying a mimetic relation to Christ. By emulating the celestial archetypes of power, King Vukašin and King Marco were identified both as living copies of Christ and heirs to the charisma of two providential monarchs, namely David and Constantine the Great. Compared to their Balkan precedents, the iconographic programs from the churches of Saint Elijah, Voronezh, and Rhetorics illustrate a distinct understanding of Byzantine imperial tradition. Unlike the frescoes at Markov Manastir, the parallelism between the enthroned figure of Christ and the representations of Moldavian voivodes can no longer be characterized in terms of symbolic imitation. In the foundations of Stephen III, the imperial status of the Savior appears only as an aspect of his universal authority. Wearing a Byzantine crown with perpendulia, but also patriarchal vestments, Christ reunited the attributes of the eternal emperor and high priest, a model beyond imitation for any monarch. In front of his unapproachable majesty, the earthly prince was reduced to a position of hierarchic subordination. Naturally, this change of status was also reflected in the compositional structure of votive images. In Byzantine imperial iconography, as well as in its Bulgarian or Serbian variants, official portraiture assumed a frontal rendering which was meant to express the sacred aura and the supernatural majesty of the basileus, perceived as a likeness of God. Apart from the crown and the splendor of ceremonial vestments, none of the defining elements of this Christomimetic hereticism was introduced in the portraits of Stephen III. On the contrary, local iconographers seem to be concerned with the representation of the homage that human princes were obliged to pay to their divine suzerain. Contrasting not only the sumptuous robes of the voivode, but also the imperial deesses, the figure of Christ included in the votive compositions did not display any insignia of power. Although the Savior was depicted in his customary vest, his status as king of all continued to be suggested by the fact that he was seated on a throne with purple pillows and a marble footstool. Such oblique references to the imperial dignity of Christ were a current practice in Byzantine visual culture. In fact, the introduction of monarchic attributes occurred only in later periods, namely in the mid-14th century. Therefore, the peculiarity of Moldavian programs lied in the systematic juxtaposition of these two seemingly antinomic models of visualizing divine royalty by joining the votive images with the imperial deesses. For a medieval beholder, the antithesis between the two ways of depicting Christ could have activated another topos of the Byzantine discourse on his monarchic authority. Eastern theologians insisted on the mystical character of the Savior's royalty, a locus classicus evoked in the frescoes at Voronezh, where the Emperor of Emperors holds an open codex which reads, I quote, "My throne is not from this world," end of quote. The Slavonic inscription contains a slightly adjusted version of an evangelical phrase excerpted from the dialogue of Jesus with Pontius Pilate, a representative of temporal authority. Commenting on this quotation in his third Antihetikos, Patriarch Nikephoros of Constantinople stated that the eternal Basileus did not need purple robes or a crown, nor other corruptible symbols that exalted the vanity of mundane kings. According to the apologist, Christ replied to the Roman governor that his kingdom was not from this world, implying that when he descended among men, he chose to take a humble appearance, concealing his divine power. Nevertheless, the incarnated Logos did not cease to shine in the glory of God the Father as emperor of all the universe. By referring to these Christological ideas, the imperial diocese at Voronezh became an iconic revelation of the Savior's authority, rendered only elusively in the votive composition. In the iconographic program at Voronezh, the sovereign status as a servant of Christ was further evidenced through the analogy with the archangels Michael and Gabriel, introduced as tertiary figures in the deity scheme. Depicted as courtiers of the heavenly king, the two taxiarches are vested in imperial garments with a chlamys and loroi. These textile accessories were probably meant to create a pictorial correspondence with the ceremonial robes of Stephen III. In Byzantine and encomiastic literature, the comparison of the monarchic office with the angelic ministry had become a commonplace, which was also expressed in liturgical formulas. Similar to the incorporeal beings, the basileus occupied an intermediary position in a space that separated God from mankind. His exact place was fixed underneath the angels, or, in rather exceptional situations, on the same level with the lowest celestial order. As remarked by Catherine Jolivet-Lévy, the iconographic similarities between the imperial figure and the representation of archangels had a twofold purpose. On one hand, these visual affinities exalted the royal power, but on the other, they stressed the common subordination towards Christ, the head of both hierarchies. While archangels were celestial messengers sent by God to guide humanity in crucial moments of sacred history, the monarch acted as a minister of the Emperor of Emperors, invested to rule the Christian nation in his name. In late 15th century Moldavian iconography, the symbolic parallelism between monarchy and the angelic ministry was equally expressed in narrative contexts. The recently restored frescoes in the narthex of the Episcopal Church in Rhetorics displays an extensive cycle of the archangel's miracles. Using a vast repertoire of biblical and hagiographical sources, the 25 scenes were not arranged in a chronological order. On the contrary, the iconographers at Rhetorics favored the configuration of thematic clusters by assembling series of 3 to 5 episodes in the 4 lateral bays of the western chamber. An important portion of the cycle, comprising images such as Moses receiving the law or Michael's apparition before the conquest of Jericho, illustrates the deeds of the heavenly archistrategos as guardian of the elect nation and of its God-anointed sovereign. Suggested by the repentance of David from the northeastern bay, the collaboration between the great angel and the princely institution was accentuated through a pictorial syntax without any known precedent. On the southwestern vault of the narthex, 2 scenes depict the joint visions of the emperors Constantine the Great and Justinian, who receives the model of Hagia Sophia. Most likely, this image referred to a specific fragment from the narrative on the temple of the Church of God, included in a literary collection dedicated to the legendary history of Constantinople, known as Patria Constantinopoleos. According to the narrative, the plan of the imperial basilica was revelated to the Thetor himself by an angel of the Lord. Old Russian versions of this text circulated in Eastern Europe since the 14th century. Located in the southwestern bay, the 2 founding moments of the Christian Empire were associated with Old Testament scenes such as Jacob's dream and the fight with the angel, but also with Saint Michael's miracle in his sanctuary in Honai. Positioned in a circular configuration, these episodes form a micro-narrative illustrating the transfer of royal legitimacy from Old Testament patriarchs to the Christian monarchs, the rulers of the new Israel, protected by the power of the archangel. In the scene of the revelation of Hagia Sophia, the appropriation of the sacred aura of biblical kings by the Roman emperors was explicitly thematized through the rendition of Justinian with the physiognomic features typical for the prophet David. Interpreted through the lens of the patriographic narrative, the identification of the basilica's founder with the David Redivivus not only implied the assimilation of Israelite royalty, but also involved the establishment of a competitive relationship. Because he bore the blame for adultery and murder, David was only allowed to gather materials for the construction of the temple in Jerusalem and to contemplate his celestial model. The sanctuary itself was erected by Solomon after his father's death. Instead, Justinian, the Christ-loving Basileus, not only received the revelation of the plans for the new temple, but also managed to complete its construction in a form that surpassed the grandeur of its Jewish prototype. Moreover, in the cycle at Rhetorics, David's status as a penitent king was highlighted in the episode of his castigation by the prophet Nathan, rendered in proskunesis. The Israelite monarch was threatened by the raised sword of the same archangel who just a few panels away revealed to Justinian the divine image of the great church. The image of David's repentance is also significant for another aspect of iconographic rhetoric regarding the monarchic institution, through which we will proceed to the second section of our presentation. The gesture of prostration at the feet of the prophet Nathan can be understood as a reference to the royal subordination to spiritual authority. In the narthex of the former cathedral in Rhetorics, this topos was evoked in the baptism of Constantine by Pope Sylvester, in a scene that marked by a strong clerical imprint. This image was placed in the upper register of the central nave in one of the most prominent positions in the entire chamber. The integration of the Constantinian model in angelic cycles is a peculiarity of iconographic programs in Moldavia. In this context, the allusion to the sacrament of initiation in the Christian religion, reiterated few years later in the narthex at Bălinești, highlighted the important validation of imperial authority by the clerical power. Paraphrasing the Byzantine canon for the celebration from the 21st of May, we note that the father of all Christian emperors was simultaneously presented as a servant of the emperor of emperors and of the church. This double subordination was also pointed out in the nave of the church in Rhetorics by the fact that above the imperial dioceses, impendant with devotive portraits, the iconographers did not include a figure of Constantine or of any other holy king, but a medallion with the bust of Pope Sylvester wearing the pontifical mitre. Thank you. Now we will pass to Vlad's part, and I will mute myself.
Thank you. I hope this doesn't start things went not so smoothly as we expected, and I apologize for this kind of situations. I will switch back to a full screen projection of our PowerPoint presentation. So, as you see, our approach is based mainly on this building of circles developing around the imperial ideas in a wider perspective, widening from the dioceses to this hagiographic and iconographic selections that I will dwell at some length at the conclusion of our mutual presentation. The inclusion of episodes related to Saint Constantine in the cycles of the miracles of the archangels, of the preserved wall paintings and icons from Moldavia, is a particularity noted in the bibliography, traditionally attributed to the supposed crusader atmosphere within the aulic milieu, capable of putting together, as in the case of the narthex in the church of Pătrăuți, references to Constantinian model of Christian royalty, to the cross as a sign of military triumph, and to Archangel Michael as protector of Christian warlords. And of course, we refer especially to this microcycle of the invention of the true cross on the eastern wall, opposed to this so labeled cavalcade of the military saints led by Constantine the Great and the Archangel Michael, showing the victorious sign of the cross. But this is the intersection that was mostly commented in relation with the iconography at Bedros. The striking episode in this context, encountered in Rhetorics and later in Bălinești, is that of the baptism of Saint Constantine, which defines a relationship of subordination of the imperial power to the priestly authority. In this context, I would like to stress upon the presence of the Roman popes in the procession of saintly bishops depicted in Moldavian apses at the end of the 15th century and in the 16th century. Among them, The most popular seems to be Saint Sylvester, who is represented alongside the three hierarchs, John Chrysostomos, Basil the Great, and Gregory the Theologian, in the central section of the procession of Pătrăuți and Popăuți. Sylvester appears again at Dobrovăț, but in a different context, as he is followed by two other Roman popes, Gregory the Great and Martin. They occupy the third, fourth, and fifth positions to the south, while opposite to them, on the fifth and sixth positions, are depicted archbishops of Constantinople, Metrophanes, and Nicephorus. The insertion of Saint Sylvester in Moldavian programs might be paralleled with Serbian examples. The illustration of Roman popes, most frequently Sylvester, but sometimes also Leo and Martin, represents a peculiar feature in the Serbian medieval wall paintings. And for instance, such is the case earlier in Sopocani between 2063 and 2070, but later in the already beginning of the 15th century, a similar situation is encountered in Manasya, where Sylvester the Great is joined by Saint Spiridonus on this frame, so to say, of the main apse. So they appear in a position which is in tandem with the one that you see here. And of course, in the 14th century, we may refer also to the situation in the Proscomede from Deciani, where Saint Sylvester is also represented in iconic portrait. And one should be also mindful of similar selection of Saint Sylvester in Wallachia, in contemporary Wallachia in the 14th century, in the church of Saint Nicholas in Purga de Argeș. The presence of Roman popes in the economy of apsidal programs raises serious issues in the light of an observation made by Christopher Walter, who pointed out synthetically that these iconographies avoid all secondary or problematic aspects. A similar situation is met with the themes connected with confessional controversies, though the most outstanding authors of mystagogical writings, which were mostly influential for the selection of the iconography in the apse, namely Nicholas of Andida and Nicholas Cabasilas, were at the same time very active in the polemic against the Latins. Given this tendency of the Byzantine iconography, the Roman popes were not a popular choice. From a statistic point of view, Walter was right to consider that the popes of Rome did not represent a popular iconographic choice throughout the Middle or late Byzantine periods. These iconographic contexts invite to an evaluation of the parallelism between the two protagonists, the emperor and the pontiff, as model for the ideal balance between the secular and spiritual authorities. So I will just simply go back to the slide with the baptism of Constantine to make this point. In my opinion, the popularity of Sylvester and alongside him of several other Roman popes might be seen as a visual expression of the fidelity manifested toward the Byzantine heritage of symphonia. I mean, the harmony which should reign between the two leaders, the spiritual and the secular leaders of the Christian oikumena, but also as a claim to the plenitude of the apostolic tradition for the local church, which expressed its pedigree through inclusion of archbishops from each of the prestigious sees of the Pentarchy, among which Rome never lost its leading role. In this context, Moldavia's canonical dependence on one of the anti-unionist chairs in the Balkans in the immediate interval following the ratification of the Union of 1439, or its remaining under the authority of Constantinople, are less antagonistic aspects. However, an iconographic argument can be added to the problem. In the case of the autocephaly of Moldavia, the selection of the holy bishops depicted in the apse might have accommodated local saints, not necessarily in the restrictive sense of a canonization of former local archbishops, but at least of the frequency of a constant group. As long as the selection proposed in the absence of the Moldavian churches seems to reflect rather the communion with the old chairs of the Orient, with a particular reverence to that of the New Rome, the hypothesis of the unrelenting dissidence towards Constantinople does not seem to be confirmed in terms of the expected impact on the apsidal iconography. It can be assumed that the disagreement with Constantinople eased after 1450, the year of the refuge of Gregory III in Rome and the guardianship of the so-called Orthodox synaxes over the patriarchal see, and especially after 1484-85, the year of the final condemnation of the Union in 1439, through a synod attended by representatives of the three patriarchies of the East. The Union of Florence was thus definitively condemned as heretical, and the partisan of the Uniatist formula, in order to be accepted back into the church, had to receive again the confirmation, a ritual canonically prescribed for the reception of heretics. The most acute sign of this communion with the great church is the inclusion of Saint Gennadius of Constantinople in the row of the officiating bishops at Popovci. This miracle-working Archbishop of New Rome is the only hierarch bearing this name, attested in the Synaxaria of the 15th century, and the intense devotion he enjoys is reflected in the choice as patron by Georgios Scholarios upon his entering into monasticism. Georgios Scholarios to become Gennadios II, the first patriarch under Turkocracy. The broader context of a collective polemical identity of the local clergy seems to consist of a strong monastic imprint, whose role in articulating and propagating imperial rhetoric can be foreshadowed through striking selections of iconic portraits from the lower register of the wall paintings from private chapels, voivodal or commissioned by the boyar elite, or from royal necropolises. They involve a wide presence of the holy monks in a spirit that descends from the familiar and intensely commented influence of the novel Barlaam and Josaphat. The allegory of the new David or the new Constantine seems to be displaced by that of the new Josaphat, noted by Vojislav Juric, and the impact of the latter is evidenced not only by the frequency of the manuscript copies of the novel, but also by the iconographic occurrences, not only iconic, such as the case here in Rădăuți and Dobrovoț, but also narrative in the gangway entrance to the precinct of Neamț Monastery, a painting which is unfortunately hardly deeply affected by overpaints. An intention to thematize the relationship between the Christian sovereign and the holy monk is found in the association of Saints Constantine and Helena in the western bay of the Naos with ascetic figures, Saint Paisius at Humor, two unidentified saints at Baia, or an entire group of hermits, such as here at Moldovița. So these are the situations in the western bay at Humor and Neamț, with this presence of Saint Paisius joined to the figures of Constantine and Helena. In Moldovița, they are joined by a full group of other four holy monks. The presence of saintly monks in the iconography of the Naos extends towards the eastern areas in Dorohoi, painted between 1522 to 25, where Saints Euthemius and Stephen the Younger partake to the choir of martyrs in the western half of the northern apse, while three more monks, among whom only Anthony could be ascertained by his name inscription, stands on the northern wall of the eastern bay in front of the sanctuary, opposite to another ascetic model, Saint John the Baptist, turned towards the theophany of the blessing Christ. Until a much needed cleansing of the fresco, what could not advance any hypothesis concerning the identity of another saint associated with the prodrome on the southern wall, this enigmatic figure here. The large open scroll that he grasps might suggest, while waiting for the restorer's intervention, that yet another prophet stands in front of the three hermits. A similar paralleling on the threshold of the apse of saintly monks with ascetic exemplar taken from the Bible is noticed earlier at Popovci. where two unidentified monks on the northern wall are mirrored by Elijah and Elisha. Most significantly, the roles displayed by the prophets address the issue of spiritual filiation and its charismatic strength, which is rather a very monastic concern. I quote, "And Elijah said, 'Elisha, you stay here. The Lord is only sending me to the Jordan.'" End of quote. Elisha has the spiritual clairvoyance to disobey this command, and this will grant him the fulfillment of a bold request. I quote, these quotes are from the phylactera, from these scrolls held by the figures. Elisha said, "Let me inherit a double share of your spirit," end of quote. The Moldavian milieu was familiar with the relevance of Elijah as an archetype for monastic contemplation, fostering on the same grounds his association with John the Baptist, aspect epitomized most clearly by an unexpected program of the Diaconicon in Lamb's monastery, which harbors an abbreviated cycle of his life. As one could already perceive from the aforementioned occurrences, the saintly monks, sometimes accompanied by biblical models of ascetic life, are given place in areas of the naos, usually set aside for martyrs. This practice is most visible at St. George in Hârlău, painted in 1530, but totally, mostly invisible now due to the deep overcoating of dirt, and it's an unrestored image until now. So I will project an image which will come later in my focus. So in Hârlău, 3 monks, of whom only Saint Stephen the Younger can be identified due to the icon of Christ that he grabs, are painted on the western half of the northern apse, while Saint Anthony and Euphemius share the northern wall of the bay in front of the iconostasis. Placed across from them, Saint George and Demetrius sit on an elongated bench, crowned by angels descending from a center corolla. This most obvious pairing of saintly monks and martyrs was already advanced at Bălinești here, where the same great martyrs, Demetrius and George, in the same triumphal rendering, are greeted from the opposite wall of the eastern bay by Saints Anthony, Gelasius, and Palladius. At Bălinești, however, the crossing between martyrs and monks is more complex and systematic, as all the openings that pierce the walls show portrayals of hermits interrupting the succession of martyrs ranged on the lower register around the naos. The southern window displays Daniel the Dendrite and Ioannicius, the northern one, Sabbats of Serbia, a very conspicuous selection, and Arsenius, while the passage to the narthex is reserved to the severely ascetic saints Onufrius and Mark the Anchorite. The most unanticipated shift between martyrs and monks is met, of course, in the naos of Saint Nicholas in Rhetorics, whose walls are in fact fully occupied by the latter category. So as you see, the martyrs were uncovered by the restoration only on these arches dividing the base of the aisles. The association of the ruler's portrait with an abundant selection of saintly monks might be indicative of an inspiration drawn from Serbian models. First of all, the only known occurrence of a votive depiction in which the donor addresses a prayer of intercession in late Byzantine tradition is the portrait of Ștefan Lazarevich at Resava. The presence of Saint Saba of Serbia, whose cult is closely linked to the political theology developed under Nemanja dynasty, among the monks represented in the naos of Bălinești, could only be conducive to such a hypothesis. More significantly, however, both Resava and Ravanica display the votive portraits in the western bay of the naos, surrounded by monks, option which was interpreted as a marker of hesychast influence, and such choice could foreshadow the unusual iconography in the naos of St. Nicholas at Rădăuți. It is crucial to take the aforementioned iconographic options as symptoms of a monastic milieu which was aware of the late Byzantine tradition. According to this tradition, the monk could be cast in the privileged role of a most active intercessor, a view which gains in relevance due to a specifically Serbian development. The surprising case of the Naos iconography at Rhetorics fully advocates in favor of such a conclusion, suggesting that the monk was seen as the appropriate spiritual model for the ruler. One must stress, in fact, that the large majority of selections evoked in this survey, and the most spectacular in any case, belong to iconographic programs displayed in public churches or in private chapels owned by the voivode or by high-ranking members of the aristocracy. Those in charge of the secular power were therefore prompted to emulate Josaphat, the prince who cautiously observes the spiritual advice offered by his master, the eremit Barlaam. This intense agency of the clergy and especially of the monastic communities in articulating and promoting imperial rhetoric in the voivodat of Moldavia in the last decades of the reign of Stephen the Great and in the first reign of Peter Rareș is therefore registered through specific iconographic selections. Attested by the prayers of the sovereign consecration rite, this rhetoric intensifies its impact through rhythmically reiterated relays in the petitions of the Eucharist anaphora or of the lite. In shaping this cultural and spiritual ambience, images play a privileged role, functioning not only as depictions of literary sources, but as possible independent sources deserving the same interest that is traditionally granted to manuscripts. A beneficial contribution of images resides in their ability to prove the degree of eclecticism of Moldavian culture, which combines diverse landmarks of the cultural continuum labeled by Elian as, I quote, Hesychast International, and by Daniel Mureșan as Oikumene Wide Network. In this respect, the hallmarks for the imperial discourse in the 15th century and in the first half of the 16th century seems to originate on the level of text in manuscripts of Târnovan ascendancy from the Second Bulgarian Empire, while the iconographic landmarks of the votive compositions indicate Serbian aulic patterns. The correlation of portraits of the sovereigns with the theme of imperial deities has Balkan precedents on the level of intentions of the iconographic discourse, but the circulation of ideas does not overlap necessarily with the circulation of forms. So at the end of our presentation today, we will draw back to the question which was addressed at the beginning, which is not a merely rhetoric question, whether such situation would be rather labeled as a situation, a hybrid situation, or as a rather eclectic situation. And I would, at the end of the presentation, I will just quite rapidly draw attention to the theoretical framework that that was prompted by our research. So recent theoretical approaches in the history of art, receptive to the broader cultural turn from the field of human sciences, reflect the concept of hybridity, reflect on the concept of hybridity as defined by Homi Bhabha. This specifically post-colonial category aimed at assessing the polarities that shape the contrasting identities of interrelating cultures postulated a process which prevents identities at either end from settling into primordial polarities, generating henceforth a third space, a culturally fertile position of in-betweenness. In a wider perspective, hybridity has existed wherever civilizations conflict, combine, and synthesize. In social and cultural theory, the term hybridization denoted eventually the intermixing and amalgamation of formerly separated social and cultural phenomena, especially of ethnic and national identities. Alongside other equivalent terms such as mixing, fusion, interpretation, syncretism, or métissage, hybridity covers a variety of processes implied in the encounters between different intellectual traditions. Their trade, so to speak, might bring forth even cases of misunderstanding, given that the interacting cultures do not in fact coexist. The third place which harbors the process of hybridization includes unequal cultural times, each engendered by the different pasts, which in turn engender equally different foresights. It is therefore useful to reflect, following the remarks of Peter Berg, on the possibility of unconscious hybridity, which might come forth when the endeavor to follow a new trend is undermined by the individual's traditional training. These observations invite to scrutinizing the process of appropriating foreign elements into a specific cultural setting with a view of carefully discriminating between entangled familiar and extraneous components of cultural objects and phenomena. On the other hand, modern historiography of art of the late medieval and early modern Eastern Mediterranean has repeatedly bemoaned the nationalist and colonialist bias with which 19th and early 20th century scholarship approached the visual culture of the multicultural and multi-confessional societies. Beginning in the later half of the previous century, critical theorists and social scientists have provided art historians with a series of novel conceptual models which have allowed the field to move beyond its erstwhile preoccupation with purity of style and form, towards a more fragmented, pluralistic, and comprehensive view of artistic production in the situation of very culturally diverse regions, such as the Principality of Moldavia, which is placed at the borders of the Byzantine oikumene. The apparently anachronistic term eclecticism could provide a useful conceptual tool as it poses a clear intentionality and harks back to the questions of agency and selection, allowing nonetheless a fluid interpretation of discrete elements coming from traditions that are not always easily grasped and ascertained. And so to conclude, our question from the title of our presentation is not a merely rhetorical question, but a very a question which we address in our everyday research, and we would mostly benefit from your any suggestions and observations on this material and on this so to say dilemma of methodological framework and approach. Thank you very much, and I apologize if we abused of your patience with our joint presentation from today.